In this video, we're going to talk about defining political boundaries. We're going to be looking at borders of all types and looking at the ways in which borders develop, and as well as some of the ways to categorize borders across the world. So first of all, I want you to pause this video and look at the borders of the substate units of the United States, which we call U.S. states. And I want you to look for some differences in the types of borders. So you might have noticed after pausing and looking at it, some interesting trends. We see the eastern half of the United States, we see a lot more squiggles. In the western half, we see a lot more straight lines. You are more likely to see borders that are kind of based on the natural outline of physical features, as well as kind of cutting up informally space on the eastern half, kind of compared with the west, which we would categorize as more geometric boundaries. And that's not a coincidence. That has to do a lot with the way the boundaries were created. And that's an example of some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. All right, so to start our journey of looking at boundaries across the world, we're first going to look at a category of boundaries that don't exist anymore. So these are called relict boundaries. They are a relict of times past. And the two examples that you see in here, and kind of the two examples that are the go-to examples for relict boundaries are the Great Wall of China and the Berlin Wall, of very different time periods, but neither one of these functions as a boundary in any sense anymore, but they do remain on the landscape and have a significant political or social importance to Germany and as well as to China, right? So we would call these relict boundaries. These are kind of two examples that I can think of relict boundaries. I mean, there might be some more out there, but these are usually kind of the go-to examples for relict boundaries. All right, so now we're going to move to talking about boundaries that actually do have a purpose. And boundaries of all types exist across the world. So first of all, it's useful to think about, what is the purpose of a border or a boundary, and why do they exist? Obviously, some simple answers here: to keep people in or out, so limiting out or inflows of migration from country to country. Or even in some countries, internally, there are sort of internal, restrictions on the flows of migration internally. And you can see kind of within the three pictures, very different types of boundaries. The first two are heavily fortified. You have India and Pakistan on the left, and then Mexico and the United States on the right. And then on the bottom, I think this is the boundary in between someplace in Maine and then Quebec. And it is a nice, lovely row of potted plants, which is impenetrable. All right, and boundaries are also important because they mark kind of the limits of our jurisdiction as countries, right? So they are a symbol of national sovereignty, and they essentially tell us, give us ideas of which space belongs to which country. So again, that's a fairly obvious answer. And borders have lots and lots and lots of other purposes as well. Interestingly, you do find them oftentimes as a way for countries or as a way for states, as we talk about in political geography, as a way for states to claim natural resources. So we're going to be looking a lot at that when we look at maritime boundaries and in the South China Seas, and some interesting examples of countries that are pretty aggressive in their claiming of national boundaries so that they can get all the fun stuff that lies underneath the ocean or lies underneath the earth. Or the airspace or something that goes along with it, right? So lots of different kind of purposes of boundaries. Now we're going to shift into talking about the types of boundaries. So some of the vocab in here is pretty intuitive and easy to understand. Some of it's a little bit more difficult. We'll start with the easy stuff. The first one is called geometric boundaries. Oh, and one thing you're going to notice about these definitions is kind of borders can be classified as more than one of these. So obviously there aren't a whole lot of physical features that are perfectly straight line. So these two are pretty mutually exclusive, but in general, something can be classified both as geometric and cultural. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. All right, so geometric boundaries are exactly what you think they are: straight line boundaries that are oftentimes drawn on the physical landscape. So these are more likely to be kind of both antecedent and superimposed boundaries, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. The other kind of boundaries to introduce that are kind of easy right off the bat are physical features, right? So these are things like mountains, deserts, rivers, which oftentimes because people are, not as likely to live in those areas, serve as a nice handy way to divide political space. So in this map, you can see the Rio Grande between the United States and Mexico, and we have that as sort of part of the boundary, as well as like France and Spain divided by the Pyrenees Mountains, and a lot of other borders across the world that are essentially physical features. A third type, and like we said, geometric is not mutually exclusive with this because you'll see some straight lines. And whenever you see straight lines, you see superimposed boundaries. They are put on the landscape by an external force. So in this case, as we talked about, due to the scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference in 1884, you had the creation of a lot of kind of zones of influence that became kind of colonial space that was organized by Europeans. And eventually the borders of this, in many cases morphed into the modern day national borders of African countries. So these superimposed boundaries that were created for colonies eventually kind of grew into a lot of the modern borders of Africa. And there's some interesting examples of that not being true, but you do see in general, these sort of correlate with each other. All right, so far we have 3 types of boundaries: geometric, physical, and superimposed. We're gonna go on to 2 more. So, and like I said, these can be kind of go along with some of the ones that we've learned before, okay? So the first term is going to be an antecedent boundary. So if you know your grammar well, you know that when you use a pronoun, the antecedent is whatever the pronoun is referring to before. So again, the word antecedent here is going to mean before. So a political boundary that existed before the cultural landscape emerged and stayed in a place kind of before or while people moved to occupy the surrounding area. So the example in here is the US and Canada, and the idea that the northern border of the United States with Canada, the straight line portion of it at least, was essentially an antecedent boundary that was created before you had a lot of development and moving in of people into that space in both the United States and Canada, at least kind of the settlers from the United States and Canada. So that's why that would be considered an antecedent boundary, because it was sort of before the settlement by that individual group of people occurred. The second way to classify is a subsequent boundary. So these are boundaries that are created and grow and are created as a result of human interaction. So the example that I have here are the borders of Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was a country up until the 1990s, starts to divide amongst itself. You have 7 constituent countries that are created out of Yugoslavia. And I think this map's a little bit old. It doesn't actually show Kosovo, which is an independent country now. But you have boundaries that are essentially created by the individual groups that live there, which become their own countries, like Slovenia and Croatia and Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So why do these borders occur? Sort of what are subsequent boundaries often used? Or sort of what are they based off of? That leads us to this idea of cultural boundaries. So again, we're going through lots and lots and lots of different types of boundaries. You can have a country's border classified as 1, or you can have a country's border classified as kind of more than 1. And it depends. The cultural boundaries sort of mark the change in the cultural landscape. So they can be geometric boundaries as well, because 2 groups can get together and decide to create a boundary and use a straight line for it. But they are used, especially in our Yugoslavia example, we have those based strictly off ethnic and religious and linguistic lines, right? So you have different groups of people that were sort of together in Yugoslavia, and then when the countries split apart, you have that geographic space sort of splitting apart based on religious and ethnic lines. And we see a lot of those types of boundaries in Europe, and we see a lot of those types of boundaries kind of in the space that it is now, the post-Cold War space in and around the Soviet Union, or what used to be the Soviet Union. And a lot of the borders within Europe are kind of linguistic borders that are kind of centered around, that become political borders. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is specifically the steps to create borders. So we've gone through a lot of different types of vocabs, but the question for this one is, how do borders actually get created? What are the 4 steps in which kind of borders are created? So the 4 steps are definition. So a border has to be legally defined. What is exactly the boundary and what is the border? It has to be delimited, so it has to be drawn specifically onto a map. Demarcated, which is the visible marking of a boundary. And then the last one is administration. So I'll come back to this, but we see here the 4 different steps. This first one, obviously these people are hard at work drawing up the borders of new countries after a brutal civil war between the different types of young millennials. The second one down here is the stage of delineation that we see, delimitation that we see, where the border is actually being drawn onto a map. It looks like maybe they're drawing the mountains too, but you get the point. The third photo is demarcation, where we have this French sign between the United States and Canada. And then the fourth picture is the actual administration. So we see the border actually kind of the administration of a border, I think between Egypt and Israel. All right, so let's talk a little bit more in depth about what they mean. So definition, right? People actually have to sit down on a table and decide what the boundary actually looks like. And sometimes this is a legally complicated and long process. So do we use the boundary that exists legally, or do we use the boundary that exists in reality? That can be an interesting question. So, lots of conferences and lots of treaties and things like that are the result of this process. The second one is to actually draw it on a map, and that is what it sounds like. And the third question is one of demarcation. So how is the border actually going to be marked? Is it going to look like, what we see in the top photos where we have really, really heavily fortified borders or is it going to be our row of potted plants that exist between countries, right? And I assume maybe there's people with guns behind the plants, but who knows? All right, and the last one, again, kind of going along with demarcation, how is the enforcement of this boundary going to work? Is this going to be open space? Do people actually cross in this crossing, or is it, in the middle of the desert where no one's actually going to cross anyway? What does legal enforcement look like? And that is kind of the last step of this process. All right, thanks. Bye.